They thought I was just another old man with a dog. Quiet, harmless, easy to push around. But the moment they vandalized my home, the moment they touched Cooper, they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. What started as petty HOA harassment turned into something darker: discrimination, intimidation, and then a gunshot that changed everything. They had no idea I'd spent my life writing the very laws they broke. And now, they're about to learn what real accountability feels like. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about justice, power, and what happens when you mess with someone who's been quiet for too long. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time you're listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, like, subscribe, and join us for the rest of the story. Trust me, you won't want to miss how it ends. I moved to Lakeside Haven expecting peace. After 3 decades in public service, 15 of those in Congress, I was ready to fade into a quieter chapter of life. No more hearings, no more shouting across aisles, no more press ambushes outside Capitol Hill. Just me, my books, the lake, and Cooper, my service dog, my shadow, my lifeline. He was a jet black Labrador with kind eyes and a loyalty that ran deeper than blood. After everything we'd been through together, my last tour overseas, the nights when PTSD clawed at my chest, he was the only constant that ever made me feel grounded. We didn't want much, just a little house with a backyard, a clean kitchen, and mornings where the loudest sound was birdsong, not a gavel slamming in a committee room. Lakeside Haven looked like the dream: gated community, immaculate lawns, flower beds that looked professionally arranged. The brochure had promised tranquil waterfront living for professionals 55 and over. It was just what I needed: somewhere that valued quiet, order, respect, or so I thought. The day Cooper and I arrived, we drew eyes like we were a circus act. I chalked it up to curiosity. New faces always stirred things up in tight-knit neighborhoods. A few people waved, though their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. I waved back politely, trying not to take it personally. Cooper, tail wagging, didn't seem to notice the cold reception. He was too busy sniffing the air, soaking in the smells of our new home. Our house sat at the edge of the lake. It wasn't flashy, just a single-story ranch with cream siding, a screened-in porch, and a small garden that I'd dreamed of turning into a little sanctuary. I had plans. Tomatoes, some rosemary, maybe even a fig tree. Cooper would lie in the sun while I read the paper and sipped coffee. I imagined we'd finally have mornings without fear or tension. But I should have known peace is never something you're given. You have to defend it. That first week passed quietly enough. I spent my time unpacking, organizing the kitchen, setting up my home office. Even in retirement, I wasn't fully retired. I was still drafting housing reform proposals quietly, anonymously. Bills that most people never saw or cared about until they needed them. Cooper stayed close. He always knew when the nightmares were creeping in or when a memory flashed uninvited. He'd nudge me gently, rest his head on my knee, or place his warm body across my feet like a weighted blanket for the soul. Neighbors came and went. A few introduced themselves with cautious courtesy names I quickly forgot because their eyes never left Cooper. One man said, "Big dog for a guy your age," like it was a joke. I smiled, didn't answer. No one asked if he was a service animal. No one really asked anything. Still, I gave people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were just old-fashioned. Maybe they'd come around. I didn't want to stir the pot. Not yet. I knew that keeping a low profile was often the best first move. Let people underestimate you. Let them think you're just another quiet old guy who mows his lawn and waves at the garbage truck. It wasn't until day 8 that I realized something was off. That morning, I found a slip of pink paper folded and taped to my front door. In bold, angry print, handwritten, not typed, it read, "Violation, unauthorized animal on premises. Immediate compliance required." The handwriting had punched so hard through the paper that it was torn in places. At first, I laughed. A short, surprised laugh. They couldn't be serious. Surely someone made a mistake. Service animals were protected under federal law Americans with Disabilities Act. Fair Housing Act hell. I'd written part of the amendment myself. I took a picture of the note, planning to email the HOA and clear things up. That's when I heard the footsteps, sharp, deliberate, approaching fast. A woman marched right onto my lawn like she owned the land under my boots. Platinum blonde hair tied back so tight. It looked like it hurt. Designer yoga outfit. One of those smiles that was all teeth and no warmth. "You must be the new neighbor with the dog," she said, already halfway across my yard. Breaking our rules on day one. She didn't introduce herself, so I took the initiative. "I'm Harold. This is Cooper. He's my service dog, Margaret Wren," she said, cutting me off. "President of the Lakeside Haven HOA. We have strict guidelines here, especially regarding pets." I stayed calm. Years of political debates had taught me when to speak and when to let silence do the heavy lifting. Cooper is a registered service animal. I have documentation. She didn't even blink. Large dogs like that affect property values. We've had issues before. "He's not a pet," I said. "He's federally protected." Her eyes flicked to Cooper, who was sitting at my side, perfectly still, perfectly alert. Then she looked back at me. "You don't look disabled." I felt my jaw tighten. That old anger, the one I kept buried under 1,000 layers of public service and press conferences, stirred in my chest. But I held it down. I gave her the same smile I used to give hostile witnesses at oversight hearings. "Not all wounds are visible, ma'am." She didn't respond. She just took out her phone and started snapping pictures of my porch, my yard, Cooper. "This isn't over," she muttered, and then turned, stomping back across my lawn like a judge exiting the bench after delivering a verdict. Cooper didn't move. He just looked up at me with those warm eyes, waiting for a cue. "Welcome home," I whispered to him. But something inside me already knew. Whatever peace I'd been chasing by moving here, it had just been declared under attack. The next morning, I took Cooper for our usual early walk. The air was thick with Florida humidity, and the lake shimmered under the morning sun. Cooper trotted ahead slightly, leash slack in my hand. He loved these quiet hours, and so did I. But I couldn't shake the feeling from yesterday. That woman, Margaret Wren, hadn't just been unfriendly. She'd been hunting for a reason. The way she looked at Cooper wasn't fear, it was control. A challenge. We passed the clubhouse and tennis courts. I noticed a few neighbors glance up from their yards and quickly turn away. One woman across the street, gray bob, wearing a visor, froze when she saw us. She turned abruptly, retreating behind her porch column like she hadn't meant to be seen. Cooper didn't care. He stopped to sniff the edge of a hydrangea bush and waited for me like nothing had changed. But I saw it. The shift. We were already the problem house. When we got back, I poured myself a cup of coffee and checked my email. There it was, an official notice from the Lakeside Haven HOA. The subject line read, "Second notice, animal violation." I opened it. The body was short and robotic, referencing Rule 3.17 about unauthorized pets and instructing me to remove Cooper within 5 days or face escalating fines. I sighed and opened the scanned PDF attachment. It was a scanned copy of the community rules, but nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it address service animals. Just a vague "no pets over 25 pounds" clause. I called the number listed. No one answered. I left a message. Calm, polite, but firm. "My name is Harold Jennings. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My dog, Cooper, is a federally recognized service animal, protected under ADA and FHA law. I'm happy to provide any documentation necessary. Please call me back." I hung up, and before I could sit back down, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and found myself face to face with Margaret Wren again. This time, she wasn't alone. A man stood behind her, tall, tan, somewhere in his 50s. Aviator sunglasses, pressed polo shirt, arms crossed like he was posing for a campaign ad. "Mr. Jennings," Margaret said, her voice syrupy sweet. "This is Mark Rollins, our HOA vice president and head of security. I glanced at the man, who gave me a nod that wasn't quite friendly. "I saw your message," Margaret continued, "and I wanted to come by in person to clarify a few things." "I appreciate that," I said. "Would you like to step inside?" "Oh, no, thank you. We'll stay right here," she said, glancing over my shoulder like she expected cameras. Cooper stood beside me, calm and still. "I think you're misunderstanding the nature of your violation," she went on. "We're not questioning whether he's a service animal. It's just that his presence is disrupting the harmony of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "He hasn't made a sound. Some of our residents are sensitive. Allergies, trauma, fear of large dogs. It's not personal. It's about maintaining a certain standard." I studied her for a beat. Her tone was measured, polished. She'd probably delivered thousands of rulings from the bench, just like this, under the guise of order and civility. It wasn't about the dog. It was about control. "I understand your concern," I said carefully. "But federal law is very clear. The HOA doesn't have the authority to override ADA protections. Cooper is a trained service dog. I'm a disabled veteran. He's not going anywhere." That wiped the smile off her face. Just for a second, Mark shifted behind her, crossing his arms tighter. "We'll be consulting legal counsel," she said. "In the meantime, I'd ask that you refrain from taking him into shared spaces, the clubhouse, the walking path, the community garden." I crossed my arms, too. "The walking path runs along a public easement. It's not HOA property." Her jaw tightened. "Well, regardless, we expect cooperation." I didn't answer right away. Just gave her that same congressional stare I used to give lobbyists who tried to bluff their way through hearings. "If you have something in writing, I'll review it," I said. Margaret gave a tight smile. "Very well. You'll be hearing from us." She turned sharply, her heels clicking against the concrete. Mark lingered for a moment, looking me up and down like he was sizing me up. "Nice house," he said. "Be a shame if it got flagged for exterior violations." Then he followed Margaret back down the path. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, feeling the old fire building in my chest. I'd been calm, measured, respectful, but they weren't interested in the law. They were interested in pushing me out. And they thought they could bully me into packing up, and leaving like this was just some game of neighborhood politics. I scratched behind Cooper's ears. "Well," I muttered, "looks like we've got ourselves a new committee." That night, I did what I always do when I feel cornered. I researched. I pulled up Lakeside Haven's HOA charter, their community regulations, public zoning maps, and every civil rights clause involving housing and disability law. I highlighted, copied, and printed. By midnight, I had a binder full of documents and a plan forming in my head. They thought I was just another old man with a big dog. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they would soon. I woke up to the sound of Cooper, barking not his usual gentle woof to let me know. The mailman had arrived, but the deep, guttural bark that meant something was wrong. I threw on a t-shirt and headed to the front door. When I stepped outside, my heart stopped. The front of my garage had been spray painted in red block letters. "Remove the dog or leave." The paint dripped down onto the pavement, bleeding into the cracks of the driveway like a threat that wouldn't wash away easily. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from the ugly familiarity of it. I'd seen things like this before, different context, different enemies, but the same cowardice. The same attempt to intimidate under the cover of darkness. Cooper stood at my side, tail stiff, head low, body tense. He didn't whimper. He never did. He just waited for my signal. I looked around. The street was quiet. Not a single soul in sight, though I knew eyes were watching from behind blinds and curtain slits. I walked over to the garage and gently touched the paint. Still tacky. This had been done within the last couple of hours, probably early morning, before sunrise. I turned toward my porch camera. The little red light blinked steady. Good. I went inside, downloaded the footage, and fast-forwarded to the window between 3 and 6 a.m. There she was, Margaret Wren, not in her yoga gear this time, but in a dark jacket and sneakers, standing at the edge of my lawn with a flashlight. She wasn't holding the spray can, but her son-in-law Mark was. He was the one doing the actual painting, glancing around nervously while Margaret pointed and directed like a conductor in a symphony of petty crime. I watched the footage again, Mark looking over his shoulder, Margaret whispering something, her mouth tense, jaw clenched. They finished quickly and disappeared back down the street. I sat in my office chair and stared at the screen, the room dark except for the glow of the monitor. I should have been furious, but what I felt was colder than anger, calm, surgical. I'd dealt with this kind of behavior before, intimidation disguised as righteousness, power used like a bludgeon. But now it was personal. They had crossed a line. Cooper laid his head on my foot, sensing my stillness. I reached down and scratched the spot behind his ears. "I guess they don't understand who they're dealing with yet," I said softly. By 8 a.m., I had filed a police report online, uploaded the video footage, and sent copies to both my attorney and my former congressional staffer, Sarah, who now ran communications for me part-time. She replied almost instantly. "Jesus, how? You want me to take this public?" "Not yet," I typed back. "Let them make a few more mistakes." I spent the next hour scrubbing the paint off the garage. The chemicals stung my nose, and the red clung to the concrete like dried blood. Cooper stayed nearby, watching the street, alert. A few neighbors passed by. None of them stopped. One or two glanced up and quickly looked away. No one asked what happened. That silence was louder than any threat. Later that morning, a thick manila envelope was left on my doorstep. No knock, no doorbell. Just dropped like a summons. Inside, 7 printed complaint forms. Every single one was about Cooper. Barking too loudly. Intimidating children. Leaving waste in common areas. One even claimed he lunged at an elderly neighbor near the mailbox. Every accusation was false. I had Cooper's certification, his training records, and footage from security cameras proving he hadn't been anywhere near those locations at the alleged times. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a coordinated effort to drive me out. Attached to the complaint packet was a formal second warning. The letterhead was stiff and overly formal, full of empty legal threats and boilerplate nonsense. At the bottom, 3 names were printed: Margaret Wren, President Mark Rollins, Vice President Dolores Finch. Secretary the first recognized Dolores. She was the woman with the gray bob and the permanent scowl, always pruning her hedges with surgical precision. I took a breath, grabbed a red pen, and began writing notes on each complaint, citing timestamps, camera footage, ADA law references, and lines from their own bylaws that they were violating. They wanted to play games? Fine. I knew how to play games too. Only difference was, I'd written some of the rules. That evening, I received my first email from a neighbor, Miss S. Jackson, retired librarian. Lived 2 doors down. It was short and careful. "I'm so sorry about what's been happening. I don't agree with the HOA's actions. I hope Cooper is okay. If you ever need help gathering evidence, I'm happy to assist quietly." Quietly. That word stood out to me. People were scared, and I understood why. Margaret wasn't just the HOA president, she was a former judge. She knew how to manipulate legal gray zones. People like her didn't bully with fists. They bullied with bureaucracy, with gossip, with power dressed up in policy. Just before bed, I took Cooper out back for his usual walk around the garden. The moon was full. His steps were light, tail wagging slightly, nose in the air. When we rounded the corner, I froze. There, in the middle of my freshly mowed lawn, sat a pile of dog waste, not Cooper's. I knew his routine, and he hadn't gone since morning. This had been planted. Another setup. I checked the perimeter cam. Sure enough, just an hour earlier, Margaret's grandson had snuck in through the side gate. glancing nervously over his shoulder, holding a small bag. He looked maybe 16, clearly ashamed, clearly following orders. The kid looked right into the camera as he dropped the bag. For a split second, he mouthed something. "Sorry." I sat back in my chair, stunned. They were using children now. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was war. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside my window. For a few brief moments, I forgot where I was. Cooper nudged my leg with his nose, as he always did when it was time to get up. He was patient like that, knowing I sometimes needed a few seconds to return from dreams that didn't always end peacefully. I pulled myself up and walked out to the back patio with my coffee in hand, barefoot, enjoying the coolness of the concrete under my feet. Cooper trotted ahead, tail swinging. I'd spent the last few days trying to hold on to a routine morning walk, breakfast, emails, legal prep. It helped keep my thoughts from spiraling, but when I looked out over my garden, I dropped my mug. Where my tomato plants had stood neatly caged and supported, there was now a blackened wasteland. The soil was scorched, leaves shriveled and curled into themselves like dead fists. Even the rosemary bush I'd just planted had turned a sickly yellow. The entire garden, which I had nurtured as a healing space not just for myself, but for the neighborhood food bank, was gone. Cooper sniffed cautiously around the edge, then looked back at me, ears lowered. The smell hit me next chemical, sharp, unmistakable. Someone had sprayed industrial weed killer, not just a little enough to poison every inch of the soil. I bent down and touched the earth. Still wet. Fresh. My hands clenched into fists. I went straight to the security feed again, praying the motion sensors had caught something. At first, it was just darkness. Then, around 3:47 a.m., a figure in a black hoodie moved across the screen, tall, slender. They approached the edge of the garden, knelt down, and pulled out a sprayer. The night vision mode showed the fine mist coating my plants in wide, deliberate arcs. I paused the footage when the figure turned back toward the house. Even under the hood, the man's profile was clear. Mark Rollins. No doubt in my mind. He'd done it himself. No kids this time. No plausible deniability. He knew what he was doing, and he wanted me to find out. This wasn't a message anymore. It was a dare. I picked up my phone and called the non-emergency police line. An officer arrived within the hour. Her name was Officer Ramirez, and she was new to the area. She took one look at the garden and shook her head. "You're Congressman Jennings, right?" she asked quietly, clipboard in hand. "Former," I said. "Technically retired." She gave a faint smile. "Well, technically, this is felony vandalism." She took photos, made notes, and watched the video with me. When Mark's face appeared on the screen, she paused it just like I had. She didn't say much, just wrote something quickly in her notebook and handed me her card. "You're not the first complaint we've had about this HOA," she said. "But you might be the first with this kind of evidence. Will it be enough to charge him?" She glanced around, making sure we weren't being watched. "Maybe, but I'd recommend a lawyer. You're not just dealing with rule breakers here. These folks think they're untouchable." I thanked her and walked her out. As her cruiser pulled away, I noticed Margaret Wren standing across the street with Dolores Finch. Dolores had a clipboard in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other. Margaret's lips were tight, her arms folded like a queen surveying her territory. I stared back. She raised her hand in a mock-friendly wave. That afternoon, I found new flyers in everyone's mailboxes, including mine. Neighborhood alert, aggressive animal activity. Below the headline was a grainy, black and white photo of Cooper lying in my front yard, mid-yawn, but they had circled his open mouth like he was baring his teeth. Below the photo it read, "Please be cautious when walking pets or children near Lot 24. Multiple residents have reported unsafe behavior and violations." Cooper, unsafe behavior. I nearly laughed. He was trained to ignore barking dogs, screaming kids, even loud trucks. He'd been tested under combat conditions. But none of that mattered to them. They weren't interested in truth. They were trying to turn the neighborhood against us with fear and fiction. I saved one of the flyers and added it to my growing evidence binder. Then I pulled the security footage from earlier that day. Sure enough, Margaret's teenage grandson had been the one delivering them stuffing mailboxes while riding a scooter like it was a Sunday paper route. It would have almost been comical if it weren't so malicious. I walked Cooper that evening, taking our usual loop around the community garden. There, standing by the roses with a tape measure, was Margaret herself, flanked by Dolores and Mark. They looked up as I approached. Margaret took a step forward, eyes narrowed. "I hope you're keeping that dog on a short leash," she said. "We've had complaints." I didn't stop walking. "From the same 3 people who vandalized my property?" Mark muttered something under his breath. Dolores waved her clipboard. "Your tomatoes were over regulation height. The rules are clear, nothing above 36 inches. You agreed to those terms when you signed." I stopped and faced them. Cooper sat beside me, calm and watchful. "You're quoting rules you don't enforce on anyone else." "I've seen the other plots. One of them has sunflowers taller than I am." Dolores huffed. "We're addressing those too." "I'm sure you are," I said, my voice low. "And I'm sure your lawyer will find that very convincing." Mark stepped forward now, puffed up like a chest-thumping peacock. "You threatening us, Congressman?" I smiled, not friendly. "No, just reminding you that laws apply here too." Margaret held up her hand, silencing him. "We're just trying to protect our community. We've worked hard to maintain a peaceful environment here. You came in with your dog, your big city attitude, and now people feel unsafe." I took a long breath, then pulled my phone from my pocket and hit play. It was a clip from the HOA meeting 3 weeks earlier, the one where they approved my garden plans. Margaret's voice, clear as day, saying, "We'd love to have fresh produce in the community space. Mr. Jennings, that's a wonderful idea." Margaret's expression dropped. Dolores blinked. Mark cursed under his breath. "You're not allowed to record HOA meetings," Dolores barked. "Actually, I am," I said, showing them the printed copy of Florida's open meeting laws. "Common areas are not private, and I have every right to document interactions that involve my property and safety." Cooper remained still beside me, watching, waiting. Mark turned and stormed off. Dolores followed, muttering. Margaret lingered, her fake calm cracking at the edges. "You're making a mistake, Harold." "No," I said. "You are." I turned and walked away, Cooper matching my stride. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst hadn't happened yet. They'd already damaged my home, my garden, my peace. The next move, I suspected, would be darker, and they were just getting started. 3 days later, I received a hand-delivered envelope, shoved aggressively into my mailbox. The return address was printed in blocky, bold letters. Lakeside Haven HOA Disciplinary Committee. No stamp. No postal markings. Whoever delivered it wanted to make sure it was received fast and without record. Inside was a typed notice, marked urgent in red ink, inviting no, demanding my presence at a special hearing to address multiple and ongoing community code violations. The language was vague, purposefully so. The hearing was scheduled for Friday evening at 6:30 p.m. in the community clubhouse. I set the letter down and stared out the window, where Cooper lay stretched across the patio, eyes half closed, breathing calm. He always knew when I was anxious. His tail gave a slow, reassuring thump on the stone when I looked his way. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a trap. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I went through every piece of footage, every flyer, every screenshot of HOA bylaws. I organized everything into a digital folder and in a printed binder thick enough to warrant a separate tote bag. I'd face Senate subcommittees with less evidence. I wasn't walking into their ambush unarmed. When Friday rolled around, I dressed in the quiet armor of someone who knew exactly what the stakes were. Button-down shirt, slacks, my old congressional lapel pin. I didn't wear it often anymore. It made people act differently around me, but tonight, I wanted it to gleam. Cooper wore his vest, his ID badge clipped to the front. His gait was calm but focused as we crossed the community lawn. The sun was beginning to set behind the lake, casting long shadows across the well-manicured grass. You'd never guess how much rot lived beneath it. The clubhouse was already crowded when we arrived. Chairs arranged in rows, folding tables stacked with paperwork, the stale scent of brewed coffee and old grievances hanging in the air. At the front sat the HOA board, Margaret Wren in the center, like a retired judge presiding over a court she never quite left, flanked by Mark and Dolores like loyal bailiffs. Conversations died as we entered. "He brought the dog?" someone whispered. "He's not allowed to bring that dog into community buildings." Cooper ignored it all, guiding me to a chair at the end of the front row. I sat silently, binder resting on my lap. His body pressed gently against my shin, grounding me. Margaret stood, tapping a gavel on the long table before her. "We'll now begin this emergency session of the Lakeside Haven Homeowners Association. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to address serious disruptions caused by one of our residents, Mr. Harold Jennings, and his failure to adhere to our community standards." I said nothing. Not yet. As stated in our charter, pets over 25 pounds are not permitted. Margaret continued, her voice smooth and practiced. Despite repeated warnings and courtesy notices, Mr. Jennings has refused to remove his animal from the premises. Whispers rippled through the room. Some nodded along. Others shifted uncomfortably. Mark stood next. Furthermore, we've received photographic evidence of animal waste left in common areas, including the walking trail and several neighbors' yards. Mr. Jennings' dog has been reported for aggressive behavior and disturbing the peace. He tossed a folder onto the table like it contained smoking gun evidence. I didn't even flinch. Dolores added her own drama. And just yesterday, a resident reported being startled when the dog barked loudly near the mailboxes. This is a peaceful community, and sudden outbursts like that can trigger anxiety in vulnerable neighbors. That was rich, coming from the woman who once screamed at the landscaping crew for trimming her hedge an inch too short. I stood slowly, every head turned. I opened my binder and pulled out Cooper's documentation, official ADA certification, training credentials, and the signed service animal declaration from my doctor. "Cooper is a service dog," I said evenly, "protected under federal law. His presence here is not optional. It is legally required and medically prescribed." Margaret opened her mouth, but I raised a hand before she could speak. "I've also brought copies of Florida's Fair Housing Act, federal ADA guidelines, and recent court decisions regarding HOA limitations on service animals. None of you," I said, scanning the room, "have the authority to overrule these laws." Mark let out a sarcastic snort. "We don't care about your technicalities, Congressman. This is a private community. We make our own rules." There it was. The mask had slipped. I turned toward the gathered residents. "You heard that, didn't you? We don't care about your laws. That's what this is really about. Power, not peace. Control, not community." Margaret banged her gavel. "Order! You are not authorized to speak to the assembly, Mr. Jennings." I turned back to her. "And yet, I am, because I pulled property values and HOA complaint records from the past 5 years. You know what I found? I plugged my laptop into the projector cord and pulled up a chart. The screen blinked to life. A series of bar graphs and maps filled the screen, showing complaint distribution by household. 80% of formal violations were issued to homeowners over the age of 60, those with disabilities, or non-white residents. That's not enforcement. That's targeting. Gasps filled the room. Someone muttered, "He's right." I advanced the slide. "You also claim property values have dropped since I moved in." That's incorrect. Listings show an 8% increase until last month, when a certain unauthorized pool addition caused water damage to a neighboring foundation. A photo appeared Margaret's backyard, mid-construction, with a backhoe parked over the property line. Her face went white. "This meeting is over," she snapped. "Not quite," I said, "because I also have a video, this one from my doorbell cam, showing your grandson being ordered to plant fake dog waste in my yard." Whispers turned to shouting. Chairs shifted. Someone stood up in the back and yelled, "He has proof!" Margaret slammed the gavel again, but the room had already begun to turn. The man next to me whispered, "I've been fined 6 times for my grandkids' toys being left out. 6 times. A woman near the window said, "They made me take down my wind chime." It was a gift from my late husband. And just like that, the floodgates broke. Years of resentment, fear, and silence spilled out like water through a cracked dam. People stood, told their stories, arbitrary fines, whispered threats, mail mysteriously going missing, flags removed without explanation. I stood quietly and let them speak. This wasn't just about me anymore, or Cooper. This was bigger. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Margaret tried one last desperate move. She stood and pointed at Cooper. "That animal is dangerous. He growled at me yesterday." I pulled out my phone and played a clip. Margaret yelling, Cooper sitting calmly, her chihuahua barking wildly on the other side of the fence. The room erupted in laughter. I looked down at Cooper, who tilted his head like he was confused by the commotion. I scratched his head gently. "Well, buddy," I whispered, "looks like the court of public opinion is finally open." And the verdict? It was just beginning. Saturday morning came with a deceptive calm. The air was light, the sky streaked with soft blue, and Cooper was unusually energetic, nudging my elbow for his morning walk before I'd even finished my coffee. For a few minutes, it felt like things were finally turning around. The fallout from the HOA meeting was still settling, but the shift in tone from the neighbors had been unmistakable. A couple of them had even approached me afterward, shaking my hand, thanking me for speaking up. One elderly gentleman had muttered, "It's about time someone stood up to her." But I also knew Margaret. People like her don't go down quietly. Power wasn't something she wielded, it was something she breathed. And losing even a fraction of it would make her desperate. As Cooper and I walked out into the backyard, I noticed that same strange silence hanging in the air. No lawnmowers, no kids, not even the usual drone of sprinklers. Just birds and wind and something I couldn't quite name. Cooper felt it too. His ears were perked, tail lowered but steady. He kept glancing toward the fence that divided my property from Margaret's. I tried to ignore it. We'd done this 100 times. I called him to my side and we started our morning training routine: balance assistance, leash maneuvers, retrieval drills. Cooper was sharp as ever. The garden still lay in ruins, but we worked around it. Every time I looked at him, I felt a sense of purpose come back to me. His loyalty, his consistency, it reminded me of the soldiers I once commanded. He'd never leave my side, not for anything. Then I heard the distinct shuffle of movement beyond the fence, followed by a voice. "I knew too well." "You filming this, Tom?" Margaret's voice hissed. I stopped mid-step and looked toward the sound. Cooper immediately moved between me and the fence, like he always did when he sensed something off. "Get a good angle," she continued. "We need proof this mutt is threatening our safety." I shook my head, exhaling slowly. This again. The theatrics, the manipulation. I'd already logged 3 complaints about her trespassing, and I had the footage to back it up. I called out over the fence calmly, "Margaret, the first suggest you put the phone away and walk back inside." There was a beat of silence. Then Tom's voice shouted, "Hey! Your dog is growling at my wife!" I looked down at Cooper. He wasn't growling. He was still, alert, tail down, head slightly turned, waiting for my signal. I stepped closer to the fence. "Tom, Cooper's a trained service animal. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to, monitoring threats, which, frankly, your behavior qualifies as..." There was no answer. Then I heard the sound that would change everything, the metallic click of a gun slide. My stomach dropped. I froze, hands slowly raising in instinctive caution. "Tom, think carefully about what you're doing. Lower the weapon. I'm the head of security here," he barked. "I have the right to protect our community. From a dog sitting in his own backyard?" Cooper didn't move. His training was kicking in at full throttle. He knew not to react to raised voices or sudden movements. He was waiting for me. I heard Margaret yell something incoherent, then what sounded like a car backfiring somewhere in the distance. And then the gun went off. The shot echoed across the neighborhood like thunder. Birds scattered from the trees. I didn't even register that I was yelling until I saw Cooper collapse at my feet, his back leg jerking, a thick stain of red blooming across his flank. "No, no, 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 no," I whispered, dropping to my knees. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me." Cooper whimpered once, his body trembling. "Self-defense!" Margaret screamed from the other side of the fence. We all saw it. The dog was attacking, but already neighbors were coming out of their homes, phones in hand, recording. One woman yelled, "That dog wasn't doing anything." Another shouted, "Call the police!" I pressed my hand against Cooper's wound, trying to slow the bleeding. My vision blurred with tears I didn't remember letting fall. I reached into my pocket, somehow managing to dial Sarah with a blood-soaked hand. "Sarah," I gasped. "It happened. They shot him. They actually shot him. Jesus, where are you?" "My backyard." "Call the team. Get the press. Everything. The first on it," she said without hesitation. Sirens began wailing in the distance. Someone had already called it in. Margaret's voice was still screeching in the background, but it was fading behind the ringing in my ears. I carried Cooper to my car, cradling him like he was a child. Blood soaked through my shirt. His head lolled slightly, but his eyes were still open, still looking at me, trusting me. "I've got you," I whispered. "You're okay. You're gonna be okay." The vet hospital was 15 minutes away. I ran 2 red lights. When I burst through the door, a young tech ran to help, eyes widening at the sight of the blood. Gunshot wound. Service animal. He's bleeding out. They took him from my arms and disappeared through the double doors. I stood there, shaking, hands crimson, shirt ruined, mind spiraling. Within the hour, the lobby began to fill. A news crew showed up, then 2, then 3. Someone had leaked the footage already. It was all over social media. Tom with the gun, Margaret shouting about property values, Cooper crumpling onto the grass. Barbara Thompson showed up next, the HOA secretary. Her makeup was smeared, face pale. You're actually him," she stammered, eyes darting between me and the TV. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am. You let us treat you like." "Like what?" She didn't answer. I sat down. My phone kept buzzing senators, journalists, veteran organizations, disability rights lawyers. Sarah had done her job. The door finally opened, and the young vet tech stepped into the waiting room, her scrubs stained with blood. "He's stable," she said. "The bullet missed all major organs, but it'll be a long recovery. He'll need surgery and rehab." I nodded, barely able to breathe. "I want to see him." She led me down the hall. Cooper lay on a metal table, the 4th line hooked up, bandages wrapped around his flank. His tail wagged once when he saw me, weak but alive. I sat beside him and took his paw in my hand. "They're not getting away with this," I whispered. "Not this time." I could hear Barbara crying behind me. I didn't care. They shot my dog. They shot a decorated, medically prescribed service animal in my own backyard, in front of witnesses, on camera. And the worst part? They thought they'd get away with it. Not anymore. By the time I walked back into the waiting room, the crowd had doubled. Cameras, reporters, residents, even a few former skeptics all watching. I stood tall, blood still staining my sleeves. "My name is Congressman Harold Jennings," I said, "and the people responsible for this attack will face the full weight of the law." And I meant every word. By the time I got home from the emergency vet clinic, the world outside had already changed. News vans lined the once pristine cul-de-sac like vultures circling a carcass. Their satellite dishes spun toward the sky. Reporters paced with microphones in hand, and camera crews scrambled to set up tripods in every direction. Cooper's blood hadn't even dried from my patio, and the story was already national. Someone had posted the video. Maybe it was the teenager down the block, or maybe one of the neighbors who had finally seen enough. Either way, it spread like wildfire. Congressman's service dog shot by HOA board member. Caught on camera. Gunfire over property values. Retired veteran targeted in gated community dispute. The headlines were everywhere. I stood behind my living room curtain, watching the chaos unfold. Margaret Martinez, now exposed, was pacing her driveway across the street in her signature designer yoga pants, frantically waving away a local reporter who refused to leave. She clutched her phone to her ear, panic carved deep into the lines of her face. It was a far cry from the smug, untouchable monarch who had confronted me just days ago. I almost pitied her. Almost. Inside, my phone buzzed non-stop. Texts from colleagues and DCPINGs from veteran support groups. Email notifications from disability rights advocates. Sarah had leaked the right clips at the right time. The footage spoke for itself. Tom Rollins raising the gun, Margaret egging him on, the crack of the shot, and Cooper collapsing, his yelp slicing through the air. I didn't need to say much. The images said everything. Still, part of me hoped the video would be enough. That maybe, just maybe, they'd retreat quietly, admit wrongdoing, apologize. I should have known better. Later that evening, there was a knock at my door. Cooper was still at the vet clinic, undergoing prep for surgery, so the silence in the house felt wrong. I peeked through the peephole and saw Barbara Thompson standing there, twisting a tissue in her hand, her usual perfect bun unraveling slightly. I opened the door partway. "Congressman Jennings," she said, barely above a whisper. "Please, we can talk. I didn't know none of us knew who you were." I leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't know I had the power to fight back." Margaret was just trying to protect the community. She didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed sharp, short. She directed her son-in-law to shoot a service dog. On camera, Barbara flinched. That wasn't planned. It had got out of hand, but maybe we can fix this. "If you would consider dropping the charges." "Dropping the charges?" I repeated. "You're here to beg for damage control." She glanced behind her. "Tom's on the city council. If this goes public, if it gets worse, it could destroy everything." "It's already public," I said, stepping aside to let her see the glowing TV in my living room. The headline banner scrolled beneath a still image of Cooper lying on the grass. "Outrage grows over HOA shooting." Barbara stared, hollow-eyed. "What do you want from us?" she asked. Finally, I walked over to the coffee table and picked up a folder. Inside were copies of every HOA violation they'd filed against me, photos of the vandalism, screenshots of discriminatory messages from their email chains. I'd even flagged a few choice quotes from HOA meeting recordings where Margaret and Dolores made thinly veiled remarks about certain kinds of homeowners. I handed it to her. "You want to make it right? Start by admitting what you've done, all of it, and sign this." She opened the folder and read the cover sheet. "Petition for immediate suspension of the Lakeside Haven HOA Board. Request for independent oversight. Mandatory civil rights training." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "Your names are going to appear in front of a congressional subcommittee," I said. "Your policies, your actions, your harassment, and your hate." Barbara's eyes welled up. "Margaret will never agree to this. Then she can explain it to the Department of Justice." She nodded slowly, gripping the folder like it weighed 100 pounds. As she turned to leave, I caught sight of the chaos continuing down the street. Tom was being led from his home in handcuffs. 2 sheriff's deputies flanked him, and someone from Animal Control was standing near their garage. It had finally begun. I closed the door and slumped into the nearest chair. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by a hollow ache. I stared at the leash still coiled near the front door. Cooper's leash. My hands were still stained faintly red from holding him after the shot. I'd washed them 3 times, but the color seemed to linger. A few hours later, Sarah called. "You need to turn on the national feed," she said. "You're trending, like really trending." I turned on the TV, just in time to see Karen Martinez, Margaret's daughter, being interviewed live outside the HOA office. Her face was blotchy, her voice high-pitched and cracking. "He never told anyone he was in Congress," she said, waving her hands wildly. "He just acted like a regular person, and then suddenly the media shows up and—" The reporter cut her off. "Ma'am, are you aware that service animals are protected under federal law, regardless of who their owner is?" Karen sputtered. "But the dog was big. He looked dangerous." The network cut the feed mid-sentence and went to a legal expert panel who wasted no time tearing apart the HOA's actions. One called it the clearest example of disability discrimination I've seen in years. Another called it a textbook case for federal intervention. Later that night, I received a message from the vet. Cooper had made it through surgery. He was groggy but stable. They'd had to remove part of the muscle tissue around the wound, but there was no permanent damage to the spine. He would walk again. I couldn't stop the tears this time. I sat alone in the dark and let them come. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because everything he'd done for me, all the nights he'd kept me anchored, all the moments when I couldn't breathe, and he laid across my chest until I found my way back. He had done it again. He'd taken a bullet for me, and he was still fighting. So was I. The morning after Cooper's surgery, I stood on my porch watching the neighborhood fall apart. Margaret's kingdom was crumbling faster than she could hide it. Reporters were camped outside the front gate. Protesters had begun gathering along the sidewalks with signs that read "Justice for Cooper and Protect Service Dogs, Not Property Values." At the edge of the cul-de-sac, a local news anchor gave a live update while a group of veterans stood silently in the background, all wearing caps from their respective branches. I watched from behind my sunglasses, coffee in hand. I wasn't hiding. I was observing, waiting. The doorbell rang around 9 a.m., and I knew before I opened the door that Sarah had arrived. She swept into my living room like a storm, in a suit phone in one hand, a leather folder under the other. "You've got backing from 4 civil rights groups, 2 disability law coalitions, and half the housing committee," she said, sitting without waiting for an invitation. "The story's now a full-blown federal case. DOJ is opening a discrimination probe against the HOA." I nodded, but I wasn't surprised. She looked at me and her expression softened. "How's he doing?" "He made it through the night," I said. "They're giving him pain meds. He's alert, but tired." Her voice dropped. "You know this is bigger than Cooper now, right?" "Yeah," I said. "But I'm doing this for him." And I was. For him, and for the other people who didn't have the platform, the proof, or the privilege to push back. That afternoon, a line of residents formed outside my door. They didn't knock, just slipped envelopes, handwritten notes, even small gifts like biscuits and dog toys through the mail slot. Many included apology letters. Some shared their own stories. An elderly woman from 2 streets over wrote that Margaret had fined her $500 for installing a wheelchair ramp without HOA permission after her husband's stroke. A single mom left a note saying she was once threatened with eviction for letting her daughter draw with chalk on the driveway. One man, a retired postal worker, said his American flag had been taken down twice because it clashed with the aesthetic. I read every word. They'd been silenced for years, bullied into submission by technicalities, fake policies, and the fear of retaliation. But Cooper's shooting had cracked the dam. Now everything was rushing out. Margaret tried to fight back. She released a public statement through her lawyer, claiming the shooting was an unfortunate misunderstanding and the result of confusion during an emotionally charged moment. She insisted the HOA deeply respected our veterans and accused me of weaponizing national attention for personal revenge. I almost laughed when I read that. Weaponizing attention? The irony would have been funny if it weren't so cruel. That night, the police returned, this time with a warrant. I stood on my lawn and watched as they entered Margaret's home and walked out carrying boxes of paperwork, USB drives, and Margaret's home computer. They didn't look rushed. They knew exactly what they were looking for. The next day, someone slid a manila envelope under my door. No name, no note. Inside were printed screenshots of internal HOA emails. Not just from Margaret, but from the entire board. One message from Dolores read, "If we don't tighten things up around here, we'll start seeing more Section 8 applications. It'll ruin the neighborhood's balance." Another from Mark, "These disability claims are always questionable. Half of them are just people trying to cheat the system." They were dated months before I'd moved in. They'd been targeting vulnerable residents for years. I had proof now. Tangible, ugly proof. I forwarded the documents to Sarah and the DOJ. By the end of the week, the HOA's social media pages were flooded with angry comments. Former residents came forward with stories of their own. A Latino family shared that they were fined weekly for the smell of their cooking. A black couple described being cited for improper lawn presentation, even though their yard matched the HOA guide perfectly. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. I stood outside that weekend, talking to neighbors for the first time without tension. The same people who once avoided eye contact were now bringing water to the protesters, giving interviews to the press, waving at me when they passed by. It was surreal. Even Mrs. Jackson, who used to call the HOA about every minor infraction, shuffled up to me with a tin of homemade dog biscuits. "I never liked the way they treated you," she said. "I just didn't know how to speak up." "You are now," I said. She nodded and patted my hand. "Good dog," she whispered, glancing at Cooper's leash on the patio. "Brave boy." That night, Sarah and I sat on the porch going over witness statements. We had over 24 now, including some from former board members who'd resigned in disgust. "They thought they were untouchable," she said. "They were for a while." My phone buzzed again. This time, it was an anonymous tip. A photo of HOA documents being shredded in Margaret's garage, time-stamped, just one day before the police raid. They were trying to cover their tracks. Too late. The story had grown beyond our neighborhood. National housing advocates were now using it to push legislation on HOA reform. My office, though technically retired, had been reactivated in a sense. I was back in touch with former colleagues, drafting new language for protections against HOA abuse, mandatory oversight, transparency rules, stronger protections for service animals, Cooper's Law. That's what they were calling it now. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh when I saw the first draft. The next morning, I got a call from the vet. Cooper had stood on his own for the first time since the shooting. Wobbly, but determined, just like always. I drove over immediately. When I walked into the recovery room, he lifted his head, his eyes locked on mine. That tail thumped once against the blanket. I sat beside him and placed my hand gently on his paw. "We did it, buddy," I whispered, "but it's not over yet." On Monday morning, I walked into the House Committee chamber for the first time in nearly a year. It was strange how familiar it all felt, like muscle memory. The security guard still nodded as I passed. The staffers whispered and pointed, not out of disrespect but recognition. Word had spread fast. I was back. And I wasn't just carrying another housing bill, I was carrying fire. The Capitol building buzzed with the usual energy. But this time, I wasn't here as a politician. I was here as a man who had nearly lost his best friend to a system that had gotten too comfortable abusing its power. Cooper's Law, as the press had started calling it, had made its way through every major outlet, and my inbox was filled with stories from people across the country, veterans, disabled Americans, elderly residents, all echoing the same refrain. This happened to me, too. That afternoon, I sat before the microphone, flanked by attorneys, advocates, and witnesses. My nameplate still read Rep. Harold Jennings. Even though I'd officially retired, no one seemed interested in changing it. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. My prepared statement sat in front of me, untouched. I didn't read from it. Instead, I told them about the morning Cooper was shot. I told them how a homeowners association, a body created to protect the value of property, had twisted its role into something cruel and unchecked. I told them about the graffiti, the threats, the lies, and the weapon that was raised against a service dog doing his job. And I told them how it didn't start with me, how it started years ago, with the quiet persecution of people who didn't fit a mold. People with disabilities, people of color, immigrants, widows, single parents, people who had no choice but to stay silent, because speaking up cost too much. I watched as members of the committee leaned in. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded with tight jaws. One of them, an old colleague from New Jersey, whispered to a staffer and held up a copy of the HOA's bylaws. He mouthed the word unconstitutional. After I spoke, I introduced several of my neighbors who had agreed to testify. Miss S. Jackson was first. Her voice trembled as she recounted how her husband's medical ramp triggered months of fines. "They made me feel like we were a burden," she said, "like being old and sick was against the rules." Then came Tanya, the single mother, who fought tears as she described how her daughter's sidewalk drawings were labeled graffiti. Then Malcolm, the retired Marine who had been fined for displaying his service flag on holidays. His voice was gravel but clear. They don't serve the community. They serve themselves. Each testimony added weight to the room. One by one, the committee members leaned forward. Phones were silenced. Notebooks filled. Staffers took rapid notes. The most powerful moment came when the vet herself testified. She showed photos of Cooper's injury, explained the nature of the surgery, and spoke of his training. "He's not just a dog," she said. "He's a lifeline. And that bullet didn't just tear through muscle, it tore through everything we claim to stand for." The hearing ended with a standing ovation, not the usual kind of political applause, but the raw, unsettled clapping of people who'd seen something real. I stepped out of the chamber and into a hallway filled with reporters. I didn't stop. I didn't need to speak. The story was already out. That night, Margaret finally resigned. It came in the form of a pre-written press release full of hollow language. Personal reasons, it said. Deep regret, it said. But there was no apology, no mention of Cooper, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Still, it didn't matter. She was done. The board dissolved the next morning under the weight of mounting lawsuits and DOJ scrutiny. Barbara Thompson tried to stay quiet, but her emails had already gone public. Her voice was recorded mocking elderly residents. Her name, once associated with order and enforcement, was now trending under hashtag HOA, reckoning. Tom Rollins was facing charges: animal cruelty, unlawful discharge of a firearm, reckless endangerment. His so-called security credentials had been revoked, and the city council voted to suspend him indefinitely pending investigation. He looked small on the news, no sunglasses, no swagger. Just another man undone by arrogance. But what stunned me the most was how fast the neighborhood changed after that. Within a week, the protest signs were replaced with thank you notes. The mailboxes stopped getting vandalized. People began hosting porch gatherings, waving to each other again. They brought casseroles to my house, some homemade dog toys, even a few get-well cards addressed to Congress Dog Cooper. The community was healing, but it hadn't forgotten. One morning, I stepped outside and found a plaque planted in front of my burned garden bed. It read, "In honor of Cooper, for his service, his sacrifice, and his strength. Not all heroes walk on two legs." It broke me. I knelt in front of it, ran my hand across the brass and whispered, "We're not done yet." Because even as the news moved on to the next big headline, I knew the real work had just begun. Sarah and I kept the pressure on. We drafted new legislative language and named the proposal the Service Animal Protection and Housing Accountability Act. It mandated federal oversight for HOA boards, required transparency in decision-making, prohibited targeted enforcement of bylaws, and added criminal penalties for interfering with service animals. We had over 80 co-sponsors in 2 weeks. But even with all the momentum, I kept my eye on Margaret. Something about her silence felt strategic. She hadn't given an interview, hadn't posted anything on social media. She'd gone quiet but not gone. Then one morning, I received a certified letter from her attorney. Inside was a 3-page statement filled with legal threats, accusations of slander, defamation, harassment. She demanded I stop speaking publicly, retract my statements, and halt all efforts to investigate the HOA board. I read it once. Then I fed it to the shredder. This wasn't a fight for reputation. This was a fight for justice. And I had no intention of backing down. Not now. Not ever. The sun was setting when I brought Cooper home. He limped slightly, his back legs stiff, and his pace slower than before, but his spirit hadn't changed. As we walked across the front lawn, a small cheer erupted from a group of neighbors gathered across the street. A little boy ran forward, holding out a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, Cooper," in bold blue marker. Cooper stopped beside him and gently nudged the sign with his nose. The boy grinned like he'd just met a superhero. In a way, he had. We stepped into the house, and I unclipped Cooper's leash. He immediately made his way to his favorite spot by the window, curled up, and let out a long, tired sigh. I sat down beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, the silence felt comforting. The neighborhood was quieter now. Not because the noise was gone, but because the tension that once filled the air had lifted. Margaret had moved out 2 days earlier. I watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her belongings into a moving truck. Her house, once the immaculate centerpiece of the block, sat empty now, its for sale sign half tilted in the lawn. Rumor had it the property value had dropped by nearly 30%. No one wanted to live in the house where a service dog was shot. Karma, it turned out, was bad for real estate. I still received letters, emails from veterans, calls from parents of disabled children, messages from dog handlers and trauma therapists. They all shared their gratitude, their outrage, their support. Some sent pictures of their own service dogs. Others told me stories of HOA, as that had forced them out, fined them, humiliated them. What happened in Lakeside Haven had struck a nerve across the country. The bill was moving quickly through Congress now. With bipartisan backing and national media coverage, it had become impossible to ignore. My colleagues called it a common sense reform, but I knew better. It wasn't just common sense. It was long overdue. The system had been broken for years. All it took to expose it was one golden retriever and one act of cruelty too blatant to be buried. Cooper's Law would pass. I knew it in my bones. One evening, I found a letter from Emma, the teenage granddaughter of Margaret. She had testified privately during the investigation, providing recordings from HOA meetings where her grandmother joked about evicting a young widow and called Cooper that freak dog. In her note, she wrote, "I'm sorry for what my family did. I'm ashamed of how they treated you and Cooper. I hope someday people remember me for standing up, not staying quiet." I wrote her back and told her that courage doesn't always come in loud moments. Sometimes it comes in quiet rebellion, in hitting record, in telling the truth. That weekend, we held a neighborhood gathering, a real one this time, with no secret agendas or HOA vote sheets. There was music, folding chairs, lemonade stands. Cooper got more attention than any of us. Kids lined up to pet him. Seniors asked to take photos with him. Even Mrs. Jackson, cane in hand, gave him a scratch behind the ear and whispered, "You're a good boy." I watched it all from the edge of the lawn, heart full and aching at the same time. This was the kind of community I'd always hoped to live in, imperfect, sure, but capable of change, type C, capable of accountability, capable of kindness. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch, with Cooper's head resting on my foot. He was healing slowly. He'd never walk quite the same again, but he was alive, and he was home. And so was I. The fight wasn't over, but we had won this battle, and I knew, without a doubt, we'd be ready for the next one, together. As I sit on this porch beside Cooper, watching the sun dip behind the trees, I'm reminded of a lesson too many of us learn late in life. Silence doesn't keep the peace, it only protects injustice. For years, I believed that if I kept to myself, followed the rules, and didn't cause trouble, others would do the same. But when power is left unchecked, whether in Congress or a homeowners association it festers. I had to learn, painfully, that standing up for what's right often comes at a cost. But it also brings clarity, strength, and community. My age didn't make me weaker, it gave me perspective, patience, and a deeper understanding of how precious real justice is. Whether you're 30 or 70, if someone tramples your dignity, speak. If you see someone else being hurt, act. We're never too old to make noise, and we're never too far along to make change. Cooper reminded me of that. His loyalty, even in pain, showed me that courage isn't loud, it's consistent. So if you've been quiet too long, I say this: it's not too late. You have more power than you think. Use it. Someone out there needs you to. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. We're building a community here, one voice, one story at a time.